Good to see everybody tonight. We've got most everyone back as part of our study. It's good to see Brian and the Fergusons, especially. We missed them this morning, and um, and uh, glad to be able to study with you. And I can see you more clearly and hopefully hear you more clearly tonight than last Sunday night. Glad to be able to study with you. Okay, we're going to take just a few minutes to quickly review, and then we're going to continue looking at the details of our Bible time periods. Last Sunday night, we reviewed our first 5 Bible time periods and the chapters associated with various events and people. The started with before the flood, the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis, the flood, which is the next 5 chapters. Are you able to see me scrolling through these? Okay.
Yes.
I'm doing something slightly different to speed up this process so I don't have to click a bunch of times. And so before the flood, the scattering of the people, those are, I think, certainly the easiest of the bunch. And we've been through them a bunch of times. We're not going to take time to, we're not going to go through those a lot tonight. But I just wanted to get everybody caught up. Again, we're going to have all of this in a format where um, uh, you'll have this for your own records and reviews if you've not been able to write this down. Um, the patriarchs, I would just mention again that you have one bit of kind of one little odd piece of this. Other than that, the patriarchs are fairly straightforward. Just to recall the chapter numbers, the only kind of odd part of this Bible time period is the inclusion of Esau uh, with one chapter in Genesis chapter 36. And again, we just kind of need to follow Edom as part of the Bible history and his interaction uh, with Israel. And then we'll take a little bit to review the Exodus, because this is where we start to get uh, more bullet points and a little bit more information. Um, Even if memorizing chapter numbers, I realize that that's a challenge, and that may be more than what your brain can hold. And for some of these, it certainly is for me. But if you can remember the main flow of thought and the main points in a particular Bible time period, then you still have the keys to be able to put things to be able to find things in your Bible. So, for example, if you remember that at the end of the book of Genesis, the children of Israel are in Egypt because of all of the events with Joseph. If you recall that, and you recall that that's where they are um, when the book of Exodus opens, well, that's the first chapter of the book of Exodus. And then well, okay, now to advance that story along, there's a deliverer. Well, that's going to be the next few chapters about Moses. And then let's see the stories of their deliverance. Well, that's the plagues. Well, I get past the first few chapters, then I get to the plagues. And and if I can remember that they get to Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, well, then, okay, the chapters before that, they're going to be getting to Mount Sinai. And I know the rest of the book of Exodus is everything that happened at Mount Sinai. Do you see how even just remembering the bigger chunks will advance the Bible story in our minds? It gives us a structure. Even if we don't remember the specific wording of every bullet point and every chapter that goes with every bullet point, by putting the big pieces in their proper place, it gives us the larger overall structure of the Bible story and allows us to be able to organize that Bible knowledge. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying there? And so that's why, and I realize that it's, we've gone over some of this over and over and over, but the more we review it, the more we drill it, the more we talk about it, the longer it's going to stick with us. And that's the goal. It's not just about memorization for memorization's sake. It's not just about being able to recite a bunch of facts, but giving us that structure in our minds so that we can accurately handle the Bible story. And then once we have the Bible story, then we can say, okay, well, we're talking about, well, just for example, this morning we're talking about we're talking about God's silence. Actually, we didn't get to this this morning. We will this next Sunday, but this morning during Bible class we were talking about God's silence, and one of the passages that I'll talk about in that is is Israel's reaction at the Red Sea crossing. Well, if I'm talking to someone and I want to talk about God's silence and how Israel respected the silence of God, well, one of those stories that illustrates that is the instance of at the Red Sea. Most of the time we're critical of Israel, but there's actually a snippet there that I think is really encouraging. I think it's a good example for us, at least from the standpoint of Moses. Well, I want to be able to put my hands on that scripture. Well, I now have a framework to be able to search that out. And I can show someone not just what I can remember in my own brain, but I can show them in the pages of the Bible. So that's where all of this is going. That's why this is an important rather exercise. All right. What I want to do tonight, that gets us through the first 5 of the of our 17 Bible time periods. Is there any of that you all would like to go back and review? Anybody have questions or want to go back and review any chapter numbers or stories or anything before we add on to that tonight? All right. Well, then let's pick up with our next Bible time period. Sorry, I thought someone else joined us, but maybe
that was me. I thought I got moved out of the way, and then I hit join, and then I see I'm already there. So
okay,
never mind.
Okay, well, I just didn't make sure I didn't accidentally kick out somebody that needed to be added to the. I've been accused of that,
I tried to change the format here, and it just didn't work. So
okay, all right, there we go. Okay, so we're going to pick up with Bible time period number 6 tonight, and that is wandering in the wilderness. All right. So I said number 6. I think it's number 6. I have to count them on my fingers. Yeah, this is the 6th Bible time period. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is exactly what we have done with our others so far. I want to go through the main people, places, and events, the bullet points that are associated with the time period, and then we'll go back and add chapters. So if you have notes in front of you, turn them over. Let's just see what we can recall. We're going to do it as a group. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but let's just see what we recall. So let me back up, and I will. This will help. This will help your memory. In order to get started, the easiest way to get started in any one of these time periods is to remember the connections between one and the other. Remember the transition points, right? So when we talk about the Exodus, and pardon me for I'm going to have to fast forward through these real quickly. But when we talk about the Exodus, we talked about where they were. We talked about the coming of a deliverer. We talked about the plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the events at Mount Sinai, and then and when we get to the end of the Bible time period of the Exodus, they travel to Kadesh. What happened at Kadesh?
12 spies were sent into the land.
Right, the spies were sent into the land. How did that end up?
They didn't like what they saw.
Yeah. Okay. So as a consequence of the report of the spies, Israel refuses to go in. All right. So that then brings us to our next Bible time period. I'm not going to go through chapter numbers right now. That brings us to our next Bible time period, wandering in the wilderness. Israel has just refused to go into the promised land. So how do we begin this Bible time period?
They were sentenced to wander in the wilderness.
Israel was sentenced to wander in the wilderness. Do you see how those connection points? All right. One logically flows from the next in these. So so as we're talking, particularly about we're talking through these larger narrative sections early on in the Bible time periods, then we see those connections. So Israel was sentenced to wander in the wilderness. All right, now the other bullet points that come in this section are big events that happen during the wandering in the wilderness, and they don't necessarily. Some of them obviously link to another. One doesn't necessarily. Not all of them necessarily link. In other words, I'm not sure that I can give you a link in particular between the first bullet point and the second. I mean, there are obviously stories in the Bible text, but I don't know that I can give you a memory device. But we want to highlight big stories, big people, places, and events in this Bible time period. So what do we include here? Anybody remember what's next?
The rebellion of Korah,
All right.
Dathan, and Abiram.
Yeah.
Okay.
Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And so you have in Numbers chapter 14, you have the people of Israel who are sentenced to wander in the wilderness. And so these are the stories that fit during the period of the wandering. One of the things you might remember is that the people began to, there was a lot of grumbling and complaining. And so they rebelled against the leadership of Moses and Aaron. That's the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So if you remember that this was a complaint against their leadership, well, then something else happened. You have them punished for their rebellion, and then God signifying Moses and Aaron's leadership. What's the next part that comes that signified God's approval of their leadership?
Aaron's rod budded.
All right, Aaron's rod that budded. All right. Anybody remember what comes next?
Death of Miriam.
All right, the death of Miriam. So you have a major character here, Moses' sister, that is involved in some of the earlier stories, and you have her passing away. That's in Numbers chapter 20. There are a couple of other things that happen in Numbers chapter 20. You have the sin of Moses and Aaron, their sin with when they struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock, failing to give God the glory. And in that same chapter, then the death of Aaron. So now we're starting to move sorry, I skipped the passing by Edom. Even after my comment earlier about Esau and Edom, passing by Edom, and then the death of Aaron. And so you have about 5 chapters here. Starting in 14, they're wandering in the wilderness, but then you have about 5 chapters where you have these stories. And then we're starting to move closer and closer toward the promised land. So you have a little bit of a fast forward, where at the end of the book of Numbers, you have a recounting of all of the places they stopped. You don't have a lot of stories for most of this period of wandering in the wilderness, but there are some important stories that we've highlighted. The people became impatient. The people became impatient because of the journey, and began to complain about that. And then the Lord punished them. That's the story of the fiery serpents in Numbers chapter 21. And again, that's an important story to remember because of the New Testament connection to John chapter 3. And then we really start pushing hard geographically and chronologically toward the land of Canaan. So you have some of the early battles of the children of Israel, conquering Sihon, king of the Amorites, Og, king of Bashan. And those early successes that Israel had on the east side of the Jordan River led to another king by the name of Balak being fearful of the Israelites, and because of his fear, seeking out the help of someone. Whose help did he seek?
Balaam.
Balaam. This is then where we get the story of Balaam, and that takes us through Numbers chapter 24. Balaam is at least in part responsible for their sin with the Midianites. And then we have a second census of the people. The book of Numbers opens with a census as they get ready to leave Mount Sinai. But now we've had this period of wandering in the wilderness. An entire generation has passed. And so there is another numbering of the people. The Midianites are slaughtered. Revenge is taken on the Midianites. And that brings us then to the events of Deuteronomy. So when we get to the end of the book of Numbers, the children of Israel are encamped on the plains of Moab, just on the east side of the Jordan River. Territory there has been captured. The Amorites, Bashan, Moabites, Midianites, all of this land on the east side of the Jordan, they're ready to cross the Jordan, but they're not ready yet. And among the things that yet needs to happen is Moses' leadership needs to be handed over, because Moses, because of the sin with Aaron back here, because of Moses and Aaron's sin, then we've had the death of Aaron. He's not going into the promised land, but Moses is still leading the people. So you have his speeches in the book of Deuteronomy, and then his death at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. The children of Israel cross the Jordan River into the promised land, and the first Passover is celebrated in the promised land. And it's the Passover. The Passover marked their exodus from Egypt. Their Passover marks now 40 years since the Exodus. That's, if you will, the anniversary date that marks the end of that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and prepares us then for the next Bible time period. All right, let's talk about assigning chapters. All right, so this Bible time period begins in Numbers chapter 14, after the people of Israel rebel against the good report of Joshua and Caleb. They believe the report of the other 10 spies and refuse to go into the land. Israel's sentenced to wander in the wilderness. That is Numbers chapter 14. It's Numbers chapter 14. Now, in this Bible time period, we don't have just a steady, consistent flow of chapter numbers. In other words, not every chapter number in the book of Numbers is going to be represented in this particular Bible time period. We're going to be skipping some chapters. We're just putting chapter numbers with the big people, places, and events that we've highlighted here. All right. Who remembers where we read the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram?
In 16.
That's right. That's chapter 16. And if you can remember the connection, that story in chapter 16, Aaron's rod that budded, follows in chapter 17. We have a group of stories that all fall into Numbers chapter 20. Miriam's death, the sin of Moses and Aaron, Israel passing by Edom, Edom refusing to let them pass through the land, and Israel having to go around Edom, and then the death of Aaron, all follow in chapter 20. All of those are in chapter 20. The story of the fiery serpents is chapter 21. So here's a way that you can remember that. You have the death of Moses and Aaron. And so Aaron is not going to be able to enter into the promised land. And so from that point forward, as far as the story in the book of Numbers is concerned, and our contents, now everything is moving toward Canaan. Not into Canaan yet, we're not there, but toward Canaan. So Moses and Aaron sinned. Well, we know Moses is going to die later, but the people can't enter the promised land as long as Aaron's with them. So you have the death of Aaron. But the people are impatient. We're getting later and later into the story. The people are impatient. That's the fiery serpents. That's chapter 21. Sihon, king of the Amorites, and conquering Og, king of Bashan. That's also in 21. These are, again, those early battles. We're moving toward the promised land. Balaam is chapters 22 through 24. That's that's an extended story. But again, now we're moving toward the promised land, and so you can see these things coming a little bit more quickly. When you have Balaam's interaction with the Midianites, well, that story needs to be resolved, and so there's more to that story. So you have the fornication with the Midianites in chapter 25. After the death of those who were guilty with the Midianites, now you have the second census. And then again, chapter 31 kind of brings that to a close when vengeance is taken on the Midianites. And that gets us through the stories of the book of Numbers. Now, somebody will say, well, there's still more left in the book of Numbers. That's true. You have more chapters to the book of Numbers, but again, you have Reuben and Gad settling on the east side of the Jordan River. You have a review of the journey and some other miscellaneous tidbits there. Nothing that is moving the main storyline forward. And so that's why we're fast forwarding over that. And that brings us then to the book of Deuteronomy. Moses' death at the end of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 34. And then to the book of Joshua 1 through 4, the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River into the promised land. And then Joshua chapter 5 is the observance of the Passover. And again, that's the 40-year mark. That's the point at which we close the period of the wandering and the preparation, and then into the next Bible time period, which is what? We're done with the wandering in the wilderness. Our next Bible time period is
Invasion.
Invasion and conquest of the land. And so we marked the anniversary with the Passover. We've got them past the period of the wandering, and now we're ready for the invasion and conquest of the land, which brings us to the book of Joshua, starting in Joshua chapter 6. All right. Anybody have any questions about that? Let me put this one back up here so that you can put it all up there. There we go. All right. Anybody have any questions or comments about the wandering in the wilderness before we jump into our next Bible time period tonight? All right. Our next one is a little bit easier than that. It's not quite as tedious. So let's see what you remember about this Bible time period. Again, we're not talking about chapter numbers yet. We're just recalling, what do we remember about the period of the invasion and conquest? So we've gotten Israel into the land. We have marked the end of the wandering with the Passover. And now this is the invasion and conquest of the land. All right. So let me jump ahead here. Again, with this one, there are some kind of subpoints to the bullet points, and that's not the part that I'm most concerned with. All right, so how does it start? How does the invasion and conquest begin? Remember, think about the map. Think about the children of Israel on the east side of the Jordan River. You've got the Sea of Galilee up north. You've got the Dead Sea to the south, the Jordan River running between. They're crossing the Jordan River, and they first cross into what part of the land?
Central.
All right, it starts with the Central Campaign. And what are the first battles of the Central Campaign?
Jericho.
Jericho's the first. And then they also take Bethel and Ai, and then they stake their claim in on the land of Shechem. So again, looking at the map, you just have the idea of they're going to take the heart of the land. That's the idea. If you don't remember Bethel, Ai, and Shechem, that okay. But starting with Jericho, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. I mean, how you just ingrain that in your brain. The walls came tumbling down. Whatever song, whatever song registers with you there. But that's where we're starting. We're starting with that Central Campaign, the children of Israel taking the heart of the land. All right, where'd they go next?
Southern.
All right, They go south. The southern campaign. This includes their treaty with the Gibeonites, fighting the kings of the south. And so that's important, the treaty with the Gibeonites, because that's one of the early indications of, quite frankly, some softening on the part of the Israelites that would get them in trouble later. All right. And so we've gone central, southern. What's left?
Northern.
The northern campaign, and you have the kings of the north led by Jabin, king of Hazor. All right, so now we have invaded and conquered the land. We've started in the middle, we've gone south, we've now gone north, and so what comes next?
Dividing up the land.
All right, dividing up the land according to the tribes. All right. Now, in the land of Canaan, the promised land, are there 12 tribal divisions in Canaan? No. Why not?
The Levites didn't get any land.
Say that again.
The Levites didn't get any land.
All right, they had some cities. They didn't have a land territory all their own. All right, that's true. And then there's another factor about the land of Canaan.
Land east of the Jordan.
All right,
was-
that's right. You had Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh who had requested land back on the other side of the Jordan River. And so now, after they've gone with their brethren and conquered the land of Canaan, now they're going to go back home. All right. So, and then you have some of the more famous chapters of the book of Joshua, where Joshua challenges the children of Israel to forsake idols and to be faithful to the Lord, where he challenges them to choose whom they will serve, and then the people who renew their covenant with Jehovah. All right, so let's put some chapter divisions with this Bible time period. We've got just a few minutes remaining. We can finish this tonight and be ready to move forward next Sunday night, Lord willing. All right, so our last Bible time period, when we talked about wandering in the wilderness, we ended where? With what event?
They observed the Passover.
All right, the observing of the Passover in the land of Canaan, and we said that was Joshua chapter
5.
5.
5. All right, Joshua 5. So we're starting in Joshua chapter 6. The central campaign is chapter 6 through 8. And of particular note, obviously, the taking of the city of Jericho and their failure at Ai. Those are kind of the two big stories of those chapters. The central campaign, why isn't this working? There we go. The central campaign's the next two chapters, 9 and 10. And the northern campaign is a single chapter in Joshua chapter 11. And so all of the great battle stories of Joshua all fall in the first half of the book of Joshua. The distribution of the land among the tribes is the biggest section of the book of Joshua, chapters 12 through 21. And that's important, but admittedly, it's not the most exciting reading in all of the Bible, where the geographic boundaries are given. And people a whole lot smarter than me and, studied ancient geography and are able to create maps, and we're very thankful for those people. And so that's the distribution of the land. And then in chapter 22, Then we get to the last few chapters. Chapter 22, those Transjordanic tribes, those eastern tribes, go home. You have Joshua's challenge in chapter 23, a challenge in chapter 24, and the people's renewed covenant in chapter 24. All right. I really wish Zoom would continue to give me a countdown clock rather than just saying less than a minute, because that's very indefinite and hard for me to know how much time I have to talk. But anybody have any questions about that? Anything we need to talk about before we finish tonight?
Mine says 1 minute, 7 seconds.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Got a counter on the top.
Well, I wish I had that clock. I don't know why mine doesn't give me that. All right. Well,
Green there.
I didn't hear the last thing you said, but
It's at the very top of the screen, about like a 3/8 of an inch tall.
yeah, that's where mine is. It just says less than a minute. So anyway, all right. Well, it's good to be able to study together. Thank you for continuing hanging in there with me. I'm trying to pick up the pace a little bit, because I know that this gets a little bit tedious, but I want to give you the information, and at the same time review these things and try to get them ingrained into our minds. Lord willing, we'll pick up there next Sunday night. You all have a great week. Thanks for studying with me. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Right.